Using sociology, how can we explain violence in sport? What is violence? The definition of violence explored by Matthews and Channon is a physical attack upon or the vigorous physical abuse of or vigorous physical struggle against a person or animal. Violence in sport is typically consented fights with the ability of athletes to withdraw at any given moment. Sport violence differs from society because in sport there is usually a relatively controlled risk of the extent of injury because the sport will be regulated. Also, violence in society outside of sport differs because there are greater consequences. At worst, a punishment in sport for violence which isn't allowed will be a ban or a fine. For example, Mike Tyson was only disqualified for one fight when he bit off part of Evander Holyfield's ear in a fight. Whereas in society, the punishment can be much greater, including prison. Common assault, which is the lowest form of violence, can be punished with up to 6 months in jail. Historical violence. Sport has violence in its roots starting at the first Olympic Games in Athens. Sport was seen as a religious festival until the Romans conquered the Greeks to make the games much more barbaric, where gladiatorial fighting was enjoyed more than foot races or discus throwing. Ancient sport is reflected in modern sports such as rugby, American football and boxing. In recent years, society has become much less violent to the public eye. Instead, violence is more behind doors. For example, English football supporters have been reported that when England win tournaments, there is a 47% increase in the number of reported alcohol-related domestic abuse cases. In total, 78% of domestic abuse cases involve a male perpetrator and a female victim. Definitions of violence. Violence as a violation can be conceptualized in terms of the verb to violate, meaning to infringe or transgress, or to exceed some limit or norm. In a sporting context, violence as a violation will be outside the rules of sport. For example, in ice hockey, the players will drop their gloves to consent to a fight. If one player doesn't drop their glove but the fight still commences, this will be seen as violence as a violation. Violence as a force differs from a violation because apart from being destructive, it has been suggested that an act of force must also be intentional or deliberate in order to count as an act of violence. In sport, violence as a force is consented to by all parties involved, as well as everyone has a right to withdraw. This makes violence as a force accepted by society and is within the rules of sport. For example, a punch in boxing or a tackle in rugby. Definitions of violence. Another definition of violence which Smith, 1983, explored is brutal body contact, described as significant bodily contact within the rules of given sport. Out of context of sport, brutal body contact would be illegal. The pairing definition with brutal body contact is borderline violence. In sport, this is where a player will violate the rules. For example, in field hockey, shoulder barging or knocking someone over will be outside the rules of the game. Borderline violence can cause injuries but is still accepted within the sport and is a regular occurrence. These types of violence are accepted in sport by athletes, match fitters and spectators. Spectators often mimic the same behaviour as the athletes because they see them as role models. Increased spectator aggression and violence can cause athletes to be more violent because the pressure to win increases due to them trying to avoid a violent crowd. Hooliganism. Hooliganism is defined as an individual who attended matches with the intention of becoming involved in violence with rival supporters or a fan who became involved in physical violence even if this was not his or her initial aim. Hooliganism exists mainly within football fans. Hooliganism can be encouraged by rivalries between teams or if there is violence on the pitch between the players. Millwall Football Club in South East London is known to have the worst fans for hooliganism. The biggest incident for hooliganism during a Millwall game is in 2002 when Millwall played against Birmingham City. Millwall lost 2-1. Fans started to riot, causing 45 police officers taken to hospital. Around 900 fans were involved in incidents including torching cars and damaging the grounds. Punishment for hooliganism tend to be bans from games. Out of a sporting context, hooligans would face much worse punishment and get away with much less. Conclusion. Studying violence can help to distinguish between sports violence within the rules of the game and outside the rules. Knowing types of violence can firstly make sport safer by reducing injury. For example, in rugby, a late tackle or high tackle can be dangerous. By classifying it as violence as a violation and making late tackles banned, less players will do it, which will decrease the number of injuries. Secondly, Violence in sport should be considered in sociology because suitable punishment should be made for being dangerously violent in sport. This is because if athletes are let off with small punishments when violent, the violence will be mirrored by society, such as hooliganism. Football hooligans may believe it is acceptable to be violent because their role models are not being punished in the same behaviour, so they mirror it in everyday life.